I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati.
Hello, happy Friday. Welcome to Sabby Sabs podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. My special guests tonight are Dr. Karim Bettache and Peter Beattie, and they are both professors at the University of Hong Kong. Hey, guys.
Hey.
Hello. Good to be here.
University of Hong Kong.
Thanks so much for coming on. I think I'm going to mute one. Okay. Thanks so much for coming on. So tonight we're going to talk about what it's like living abroad. Is life necessarily better abroad? So all three of us have lived outside of the United States at some point or another. And we're going to start off by discussing that. And I broke this up into 4 different categories. The first one is education. Second is jobs. Third is healthcare. And fourth is community. So I want to go ahead and ask, originally, before we get into the 4 categories, how did the two of you end up at the University of Hong Kong?
Shall I start or Peter? So in my case, so I'm not from the United States, of course. I'm from the Netherlands, but I'm from the West, just like you guys. And I actually went on exchange when I was an undergraduate student back in 2008 to Hong Kong. Actually, this really opened my eyes to the rest of the world, so to speak, outside of my Northern European bubble. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. So I went back the next year to do some research. And then eventually I did my PhD in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong has a very good track record in the field that I am part of, the psychology, social psychology. And then I did a postdoc in Hong Kong, and I started teaching in Hong Kong. And then I left for 3 years to live in Malaysia. And then I came back to Hong Kong to start working as a professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And so now, if I count, I'm almost 10 years now living in. Oh no, I'm actually living for 10 years in Asia and approximately eight years in Hong Kong. Yeah. So long time already.
Yeah, and for me, I was just looking for jobs outside of the U.S. all over the world. And when I got the offer here, I jumped at it because a bunch of friends had recommended Hong Kong as a incredibly beautiful city, easy to get to other places in Asia where I hadn't really lived or traveled to very much at all before. So that's how I ended up here at the Chinese University.
Awesome. So I want to get started with education, because this is one I think that, a lot of people watching just may not realize how different the education systems are abroad compared to the United States. When you think about the education system, I'm going to start with you, Peter, actually, because I know you went to school in the U.S. When you think about the education system here in the United States compared to what you've seen abroad, what would you say are some of the pros and some of the cons?
Well, I think it depends a lot on whether you're talking about like primary and secondary education versus higher education. For higher education, I would highly recommend people get the hell out of the US just to avoid massive amounts of student loan debt. And there are options all over the world that are a hell of a lot more affordable than the absolutely insane situation that prevails in the US. When it comes to primary and secondary, that varies a lot. Like if you're living in the US in a wealthy zip code, wealthy county, the schools are probably pretty good. If you're not in a wealthy county and you're raising children, then you might want to look abroad for primary and secondary education as well. Also, I mean, it's just probably a better, like full, well-rounded education to have kids live outside of the U.S. and see the world a little bit, because that's another problem with the U.S. educational system. You end up being very ignorant of the rest of the world.
Karim?
Yeah, so I have to compare it with the Netherlands. The Netherlands is going a bit into the direction of the United States in that our universities are not for studying is not for free, like for example in Germany, and that we have a huge student loan debt as well, because we borrow support from the government during our studies, and then later on we have to pay it back. It's not as extreme as in the US, but it's a lot of money. But the education system itself is, I cannot really complain about that. I think the Netherlands has a very good education system. All universities are public. There are no private universities. So you get pretty much the same quality everywhere. And that's just good quality science. But Asia, and in particular societies such as Hong Kong, but also mainland China, many cities, Japan, Singapore, these are really top schools. People often live in their own Western bubble and don't realize that. But you will be amazed how many universities in Asia now are already in the global top 50, like ours. And these universities are high quality. You get good training. You have a lot of money for research. And that was something that really struck me, that you can really see that the vibrant academic community, vibrant academic life here is really almost taking over the academic world in the West, that is actually falling a bit, how can you say that in English? Falling in a kind of a sleep, you know what I mean? Like we had that prime, those days of Cambridge and Oxford and that kind of stuff. And you really see that center is shifting to Asia. And yeah, what can I say? I'm happy to be part of that academic community over here. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess I can talk about this in two different ways. I went to elementary school and middle school in Germany. I did notice when we came back to the United States, when it came to the math and science courses, Germany was further ahead. And I what I mean when I say that is that when we came back to the States, the teachers were teaching Algebra 1, and we had already learned that the year before in Germany, if that makes sense. So that was one thing I did notice, is it seemed like the math and science courses were far more advanced. And then another thing I've noticed in reference to in higher education, a lot of my students are from China. I used to, well, not anymore, but I used to work at BU. My audience knows this story until about 2 weeks ago. But most of my students were from China. And one of the things I've noticed as well is they would always tell me that they wanted to come to school in the US to get a degree from the US. But when I would ask them, like, do you want to get a job in the US? Most of them would say no. They would say they didn't want to go through the visa process. It's annoying. They wanted to go back home. They're like, I can get a job easier, like back home. But again, the math and science skills were way more advanced than what we had here in the United States. Just something I've noticed.
And international tests bear that out. Like the U.S. doesn't do terribly well on these like international tests of reading comprehension, science, and math. But in the U.S., you have like, you know, the rich county public schools and the private schools that are well funded. Kids from those do, you know, comparably well to kids in countries with the best educational systems. It's just that there's such a crazy disparity in school funding and quality in the U.S. that the non-rich counties basically drag down the U.S. average.
Yeah, and I also noticed that what you're saying, that the Chinese students are going to your part of the world. I remember back in the day when I started to apply for my PhD program in Hong Kong. I remember the head of my university. Really, it's just typical. But the head of my university in the Netherlands, University of Groningen, it's the most northern university. And I said, okay, I needed some signature from him for my application and whatever. And I remember he saying, "You're going to Hong Kong?" I said, "I'm planning to go to Hong Kong." And he was like, "But these people want to come here, right? Why would you go there?" You know, that old, arrogant Western mindset. But you actually see a change right now. And I think Peter can agree with me, is that you slowly see that a lot of Chinese students, instead of going abroad, they choose a top university within China. But you also have a lot of Koreans and Japanese coming to top schools in Asia. And we increasingly have Western students coming over here. So that's we are really living in that transition period, which is really interesting to see. I personally love it. You know what I mean? And just quickly, Peter, and also the reason why one of the reasons why I went to Hong Kong, and maybe we can get deeper into that later, I think that would be interesting, is also that reaction from my university head in the Netherlands. You know, that kind of still that kind of old school Western racism that you had was also one of the reasons why I actually left the West to go to Hong Kong. But that's maybe something for later. Peter?
Yeah, I was just going to add in, I've been hearing from students that the value of U.S. university degrees in China is on the decline, whereas, I don't know, 10 years ago, that would be a guaranteed job ticket, you know, if you have a U.S. university degree. But recently, I guess over the past couple of years, I've been hearing that it's no longer viewed as such a job ticket. Like the value of U.S. university degrees has been decreasing relative to universities in other parts of the world, including in China.
No, that's interesting to hear. I know one of the things that we struggled with in reference to admissions or working with admissions, they always wanted us to increase the number of domestic students in these competitive PhD science and math programs here in the United States. And it was very difficult to do that because when it came to the grades and the test scores, they weren't there. The domestic students were not there. And so every now and then we would say, we'll give them a chance, and we give them a chance. And what we found is that we let those students into those programs and they would struggle and they would fail. And then they ended up back home. And I'm wondering, like, your opinion about that. What do you feel could be done differently in the United States or in Western education in like K through 12 that can help prepare those students to do better in the math and science courses?
Well, I mean, I don't read that much about pedagogy, so I don't really know, like, you know, what the best practices are and like what evidence there is for this or that. But as a non-expert in this area, my reaction would just be, why don't you just look around the world at the countries whose school systems perform better on international tests and just adopt what they're doing. Like Finland is a good example. Like one thing that I was really surprised to hear, because my sister moved to Finland, is that they basically got rid of homework. They don't give out much homework because they studied it and found that the measurable positive impact was very, very low. So it's that sort of thing. Like, why not just look around the world, see what works, and just adopt whatever works? And if that means, you know, you have to hire more teachers, well, then so be it. But
yeah, so I cannot say too much about the US. I just remember, and I've discussed this situation with Peter before. I just remember back in the day that I think it was around 2009 or 2010 that our university had a temporary moratorium on accepting students from the US, including Ivy League students, because they just consistently failed on in our programs. I never forgot that situation, which was very, very interesting to hear.
So here's a question from Yipper99. This is interesting. Do international schools teach or teach towards a test?
I don't know about how it is all over the world, but from what I hear in Hong Kong, the public schools very much do that. Like they focus on getting kids to just memorize stuff so that they can do well on tests. But then interestingly, the private schools, which are insanely expensive, they're much more, I guess, along the Finnish model of like, hey kids, be inspired, chase your passion, like a much more open learning environment with much less focus on just route memorization. which I found odd because here there's so much of a cultural value towards education. Like, in the U.S., you'll have people say like, "Oh, hey, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich?" Like, there's no like inherent cultural like respect for teachers, whereas in this hemisphere, the Eastern Hemisphere, like that's a very widespread cultural practice of just respecting teachers a lot. So it still puzzles me why the public schools don't just adopt what they do in the rich private schools. If it's a matter of hiring more teachers, like money isn't really an object here. So I don't know, that puzzles me, but certainly here in the public schools, there is a lot of teaching towards the test. But in other countries, I'm not so sure.
Awesome. Humanitarian Genocide said, is it possible to study in Asia if you don't speak one of the Chinese languages? Good question.
Definitely. So I don't speak Chinese. I spoke a bit of basic Cantonese because I live in Hong Kong now for quite a while. But if you go to Singapore, all the top schools are, and I'm talking about universities, are in English. Malaysia, Hong Kong, all of them. So you don't need Chinese, but it's all, they call it tertiary education, but pretty much everything is in English. And that is why you have students coming from all over the world. The basic language is English. But of course, I must tell you that, of course, in certain more monocultural societies, such as Korea or Japan, you do need the local language. But there are quite a few societies in Asia that actually, East Asia, because this question was about China in particular, where you definitely can study in English, and for mainland China probably not as much, but in Hong Kong, there are many great schools where you can study in English.
Awesome. So Peter, this question is for you. When you first moved to Hong Kong, did you run into any of those issues in reference to language before you started teaching?
No, not really. I mean, like Hong Kong might be a special case in that it has the British colonial legacy. So English is pretty widespread throughout the society. Not to 100%. Like not everyone speaks well, but it's this place in particular in Asia is extremely easy to get by in English. It's not an issue here.
I'm going to answer this question really quick from YepX. Whoops, not that one. Sorry. I'll come back. YepX. Lawrence Johnson, Sabby, did you have to learn German when you were abroad? No, I didn't have to. I went to Dodd schools. I don't know if you guys are familiar with those, but they're military schools abroad. And also in Germany, like even if you didn't live on base, like most people I ran into that were German spoke English. So that was another thing. We did do a field trip. We went to a German school. And I noticed that when we went to the field trip is that all the students in the German school, they were learning English and German at the same time. So I think we're like the only country, the United States, like the only country where it doesn't seem to be required to necessarily learn a second language.
Yeah, and it isn't treated very seriously in U.S. schools. Second languages are like, at least in my experience, which is limited, but from what I hear from friends and whatnot, like language in primary and secondary school is not considered like a really serious subject. They don't really try to make people fluent.
Agreed. I want to go into the next topic, which is jobs. Talking about jobs abroad, when you think about, jobs in like Western culture, this is going to be a little bit different because I know the currency is different, but a lot of times like here, we're complaining about a minimum wage. We're complaining about having a living wage, which we don't really have here in the United States. How would you compare that to where you are in Hong Kong? Is there a minimum wage and is there a living wage?
Well, I would say Hong Kong is a hardcore neoliberal capitalist society, so beware. But it's slowly turning into a more traditional Chinese society since the takeover. So that can be a very good thing. But the British had installed a very, very capitalist society here. So What I'm trying to say is that when you are lower socioeconomic status in Hong Kong, it's not a lot of fun. Believe me, that's hard. That's really hard, and there's not a lot of social welfare. But the interesting thing about Hong Kong is that it does have, for example, very good public healthcare, okay, where you can just go and almost pay nothing. And also, when you have a middle class job or a upper middle class job, for example, then the salary is very good. Then the city is great. You know what I mean? Very comparable to many Western cities, I guess. But that is something I really noticed. That Hong Kong has this extreme gap between the wealthy and the poor, and you can see it sometimes. But at the same time, Hong Kong also has these very interesting stuff that helps people, such as the public healthcare, which is really, really magnificent. You know, maybe Peter has something to add.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, my limited experience with the public healthcare system was fantastic. Like, I remember getting a prescription for like 5 different medicines when I was sick one time, and this was in the public system. So you see the doctor, and it was like a very small fee to pay. And then they give you the prescription, you go downstairs and there's a pharmacy. And I saw ahead of me people going and getting their medicine, and there's no money exchanging hands. So I kind of got the sense that it was going to be free. But coming from the US, I wasn't comfortable with that idea. So, I asked the pharmacist after she gives me the medicine, like, so how much is it? And she looks at me like I'm an alien. Like, what are you talking about? Like, you're sick. I just gave you medicine. Why are you asking about money? And so I had to ask her like twice, just because I knew the answer, but I just wanted to hear it again. But yeah, on the minimum wage, the minimum wage is actually pretty shameful here. It's like 35, 36 Hong Kong dollars an hour, which translates into like $6-7 US dollars an hour. And with the cost of living here, that's criminal. But they do have a lot of public housing. There's a lot of complaints here about the wait times to get public housing. There's an insufficient supply because it's very much like New York. It's an oligarchy ruled by finance and real estate, but it doesn't have the harsh edges of a city like New York, because while public housing you have to wait way too long, you still have to wait a lot less than you would in New York. There aren't anywhere near as many homeless people in Hong Kong. And the key thing is the public healthcare system. Like, that is such a huge, an issue of huge importance for people when you don't have a lot of money, at least not having to worry about dying or, getting a crippling disease that you can't afford to treat.
And do you know, like, how do they pay for the healthcare system? Because that's the biggest complaint that people have here in the US is when we talk about Medicare for all, we talk about universal healthcare. People on, liberals and people on the right will complain and say, well, how are you going to pay for it? So do you know how they pay for it in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I mean, they pay for it through taxes. Like, Hong Kong is a place where I saw your excellent interview with Fidel Kaboub yesterday. And that was awesome. But like, MMT is a perspective, right? And it's a perspective that especially applies to countries with a so-called sovereign currency, which has a number of features. But the key thing here is that Hong Kong doesn't have a sovereign currency because their currency is pegged to the US dollar. So their ability to create money the way that the US government can is much more limited. But it's also, and has been for quite a while, a major financial center, as the British set it up as a opium trading depot that also was the kind of home base of a number of banks that got their start in laundering drug money and continue to launder drug money today, HSBC. So there is this massive financial center. So there's a lot of wealth. So even with the very low tax rate, there's plenty of revenue that the government can collect to pay for the healthcare system, the public healthcare system, that is.
And still, let's not forget, Hong Kong is a low tax society. It's not that you pay a lot of taxes here. You know what I mean? So it's easily doable.
Wow. Okay, that makes sense. I want to give a shout out to Red Precarian. Thanks so much for the super chat. Support indie media, like, share, comment. Thanks so much, Red Precarian. All right, Yepex, I got your question here. What are other country policies on those with disabilities? benefits, housing, food stamps, social security, etc.? That's a good question. I'll open it up to you guys.
Karim, you want to go with Europe first?
Sure. If you go to Europe, I would say if you would live in the Netherlands, where I'm from, that's pretty good. It's the Netherlands is always in that list. The Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland. Always these three are always topping those lists of social welfare. So I would say that is pretty good. We see very recently, I think it's maybe one or almost 2 decades old, we have food stamps. So neoliberalism is, and I'm not talking about neoliberalism as in Democrats, I'm talking about free market economics. Neoliberalism is slowly ravaging our societies as well. So you see the decline, so to speak. You see it in the UK, it's horrible. You see it in France, it's really bad, and slowly we are catching up, so to speak. But up till now, if you compare it to the United States, it's so much better, because you guys, if you don't have enough money, I mean, it's very scary. You're on your own, like survive. You know what I mean? For us, that's very shocking. We always call the United States an extremely harsh society. For example, the fact that you guys go to a hospital, you need help, you need serious help. And if you don't have the money or insurance, they stop you at the door. For us, this is insane. In fact, for us, by law, even if you cannot pay, the hospital is required to take you in and help you. Okay, how are you going to pay later? That's your problem. They're going to check. They will check your income or whatever. But if you go there and there's a serious problem, they always need to help you. And I think that this is something that is very, very needed all over the world, that you have that safety feeling in your life, that if something happens to me, at least I can get help. How I pay for it later, I will see it. But the fact that you guys have to live with that constant fear that if you don't have enough money, you may die, it's just, to me, it's inhumane, unfathomable.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, like, my parents were in the military, so I grew up with TRICARE health insurance, and TRICARE pretty much pays for everything. And Nico House was saying this too when he said this recently. He was like, I don't know how the rest of you are alive.
Yeah,
exactly.
The US military is like one of the few socialist institutions in the U.S. Like, you can experience what it's like to have like a socialist mini government in your life.
Except the fact that the U.S. Army is, of course, destroying socialists around the world. But yeah, I get what you mean.
Socialist in the U.S. sense of anytime the government spends on public investment.
No, it's true. I'm curious about, I want to hear about the Netherlands and also with Hong Kong. I'm curious when you think about having a sense of community. And I go back to this oftentimes because I just feel like me and Josana talked about this before. Her coming from Brazil and coming to the US, and not just coming to the US, but coming to the US to live in New York, which can be one of the hardest places to live here, I think, in my opinion. There just seems to be, like, in the United States, we don't have a sense of community. And what I mean by that is, one of my students told me he was from India, and he said, like, when he came here for school, he was like, I don't get this culture because it just seems like everybody here is all about their self. It's all about the individual. He said it kind of comes across as kind of selfish in a way. And he said in India, you would never have to leave your home. Like, your family would never tell you, okay, you're 18, it's time for you to get your own place. And he said, no, you would never like just abandon your family like that, right? And I told him, I was just like, that sounds great. I was like, but I will tell you, here in America, when you're here, you're on your own. And I wonder how that is like in the Netherlands and in Hong Kong. Do you feel like they have more of the same kind of culture we have in the United States, where it's more about the individual, or do they have a stronger sense of community?
I don't know. Karim, do you want to start off with Europe or? Okay, so like in Hong Kong is like Karim said, it's historically a very neoliberal city. Before that, just a economically liberal city, and a British colony that was set up primarily to deal opium, right? So you still have some traces of that reduces the culture shock for me. But I would still have to say, like, there's definitely more of a sense of community here than you would see broadly in the U.S. And I think the key difference is, the U.S. is a settler colonial society. And I don't say that just to, like, as a kind of moral stick to beat it over the head with and say, oh, U.S. bad. I mean it as like a descriptive, historically relevant founding aspect of the United States. Like, it's a bunch of people leaving their organic communities, leaving their families to settle in a place where they don't know anyone, taking land from the natives, like having violent and antagonistic relationships with people in the land, hyper competitive, rule of law very minimal. That's the history of the U.S. And even today, with the economic structure being what it is, you're basically required to pick up and move to wherever the jobs are available. That's the idea of a free market in labor, and that is, of course, not very conducive to creating these tight-knit organic communities. I think in most of the rest of the world that I've seen, there's much more of a sense of community, for two reasons. Like, one, lots of places in the world are not settler colonial societies. And the other thing is, if you don't have as much of a history of economic policies and economic structures that incentivize people to just pick up and move, to go wherever the jobs are, to go wherever the money is. So between those two factors, I think that's the main explanation I would give for, like, why you find tighter knit communities outside of the U.S. compared to within the U.S.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I would say the Netherlands, so in social psychology, we have that it's called the individualism index. And in social psychology, you would see that both the Netherlands and the US always rank in the top 5 or top 10. So both societies are extremely individualist. And the Netherlands, before the British took over, the first 100 years, the Netherlands was the global colonial superpower. And actually, according to many scholars, the inventor almost of our capitalist system. So you can imagine that whole settler colonial kind of attitude is also deeply nested in our societies. And I think one of the problems that I had in the West, coming from a half Dutch, half Algerian family with a father who comes from a post-colonial society, is that for me it became too much. Okay, I don't carry a Dutch name. You feel that for pretty much all of your life, applying for jobs, getting into PhD programs or whatever. While maybe you're very talented, you get the highest marks in school, it doesn't matter. Okay, you're always judged on something that is external to who you are. And I think a lot of people of color, but minority groups in the United States can agree with this sentiment. And this was one of the reasons for me that I said, okay, I'm done. A society that does not appreciate its own, why the hell would I give my talent to this society? So I start applying to good schools in another part of the world where your name doesn't carry that same stereotypical label in the minds of people, and you're just treated as anyone else as an academic, which is very liberating, which is extremely liberating. And I think for smart young academics in the United States, people of color from minority backgrounds, I think it's very wise for them to start looking outside their border to good schools, because often they are more appreciated abroad than in their own country. And even me, who is racially very ambiguous to see, even I have felt that, and I can attest to that. So that's really an advice I want to give young academics who are marginalized in the United States, to really start looking across the border, because there's a whole world out there for them.
I agree. And this is something that I wish I could have told my students, but I couldn't, obviously, because they were my students. But I saw a lot of them struggle with the tuition. I mean, it's very expensive to go to school here in Boston, Massachusetts in general, to be honest with you, because most of the schools here are private. It's just reality. I wish I could have told them, you don't have to limit yourself to going to school in the United States. You can go to school in Canada if you don't want to be too far away from home, or you can go to school abroad, go to school in Germany, just try something different. It doesn't have to be necessarily the United States way. And I think that I think that it's harder to convince Americans to do that, and it's easier to convince internationals to come here. And one of the questions that I've always had is I would have students come here and they would tell me how great things are, like in the country they're coming from. And sometimes I would think in the back of my head, like, why did you come here? Like, no, it's not going to be, this is not going to be fun for you here. And I've had students that go through a culture shock coming here and just kind of break down because it can be pretty tough here, especially if people feel you don't speak English well enough. Um, Even though I may feel they speak English well, sometimes there's some people that are kind of picky about that, right? And then even in the United States, even though most of us speak English here, then you have to deal with different accents, right? So you have people in the Northeast, the West Coast, the South. So there's just a lot of differences. And I think that that's one of the questions I have for you guys. Like, do you feel that it's harder to convince Americans to move overseas than it is to convince internationals to come west? And why do you think that is?
Well, if you ask me, that this has everything to do with the kind of history that we come from. We are now slowly transitioning out of the 500 years history of Western hegemony and colonialism. And in those days, in the western part of the world, in particular Northwest Europe and North America, you had these very prestigious universities, of course, Cambridge, Harvard, and other names all over Europe, in Switzerland, Netherlands, or France, and of course in Canada also has very good schools, and that is the kind of prestige that you build up over the course of history, and that is always that always takes a very long time to break down. Same as how long it takes for people to start accepting China as a global superpower and as equals. That's very weird in the West to internalize, like to see people, especially who don't look European, who don't look Western, to start seeing them as equal human beings who are a contender. It's still very strange, you know what I mean? But the funny thing is, when you come here and you work in academia like Peter and myself, you realize like you immediately that all that these conceptions just how can I say them? They melt away because of the impressive intellectual capabilities that you see in this part of the world, of your colleagues and the students. I mean, this is just amazing. I felt intimidated at times, and after a while you get into that culture and you get used to it. But like I said before in the beginning, the interesting thing is that is changing now. Just like China is coming up in the global power sphere, so to speak. And similarly, students increasingly choose to stay within Asia, and increasingly students from the West choose to come to Asia. However, there is still that old school stereotypical mindset about the West, Cambridge and that kind of stuff. And that it takes some time, I guess, to melt away, but we are not there yet. It still has that prestigious name, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I would say, like, even like to expand on that, the soft power of the U.S. is still predominant in the world. So there's so many people in this part of the world whose knowledge of the U.S. comes from movies, TV, but also like prestigious media. So, they have this idea of the U.S. that's very disconnected from reality. They're not aware of the extent of poverty. They're oftentimes shocked when they do learn about that. So just imagine like the difference between people's actual lived experience in the U.S. and what you would see if the only connection you had to the U.S. were movies and TV shows. So that kind of disconnect is still very much alive. So I think that's part of the reason why a lot of people from other countries want to go to the U.S. And then, of course, it's like Karim was saying, the prestige game. Like the names of U.S. universities still hold a lot of currency around the world. So until that changes, you probably will still have a lot of demand. But as the U.S. kind of falls apart day by day, that very well might be changing before our very eyes.
Okay, that leads me to another point. So in the United States, the past year, and now going into 2022, there's been a lot of labor movements, a lot of strikes happening. Kroger, which is a grocery store here, just announced that 8,500 employees in the Denver area of Colorado just went on strike. Do you see those types of uprisings in China or in the Netherlands?
Oh, oops, sorry.
Go ahead, Peter.
In China, there used to be like this tracking of strike activity. I don't think it's still going on because data collection on this has become more and more sensitive. But at least as of a few years ago, there were lots and lots of wildcat strikes throughout China. So I would presume that there still are. It gets into a really like thorny political issue because, from the Chinese government perspective, if your main goal is to strengthen your country so that it can't be crushed by the empire, then you put a premium on economic growth and development, especially moving up the value added ladder, like being able to produce more and more advanced goods. So from that perspective, you want to grease the wheels of business. You want to make China the most attractive investment destination possible, so that capitalists all over the world will pour their money into the country, and some of that money will be used to buy productive equipment. More people will be trained in that sort of slow piecemeal manner. You climb up that ladder, and then you're no longer as vulnerable to being crushed by economic warfare. So then that puts a very antagonistic relationship between the government and worker unions, because unions are anathema to capitalists the world over. They just don't like the uncertainty with the wage bill they're going to have to pay. They don't like the lack of flexibility they get when workers can actually have a say. So it's a complicated situation where the government wants to develop as fast as possible. They don't want a lot of worker unrest. But we do have data from years ago indicating that there are a lot of strikes. But right now, the picture is a little blurrier because we don't really know what's going on as well as we did in the past.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I would say in the Netherlands, we don't see many strikes. I guess the situation is still too good for that. People can still relatively get by. But we do have, of course, our anti-lockdown protests and anti-vax kind of protests. But beside that, not much is happening in the Netherlands, luckily still.
Although I should add, since we're on the Asian continent, India just had one of the biggest strikes in world history with the farm workers strike, and they won. They just straight out won. The government was trying to impose some neoliberal reforms on the farming sector that would probably increase the power of agribusiness and take power away from small farmers. They went on strike. They blocked the capital city, and they just won. The government gave up on their plan because they realized that politically it was too costly. So there is that. That's an example for the world to pay attention to.
Wow. Yipper99 is asking, how do you study abroad? What is the route to take? And I think they're talking about full time and not like a semester study abroad.
Well, I did that. So in my case, it was for my PhD. And it's actually very simple. What you need to do is just go to the website of a university, let's say in Hong Kong or Singapore or whatever, just one of the cities where you have very good universities. And then check their application requirements. And usually application requirements are just writing a statement of purpose, giving your grades, the documents with your grades, probably 3 references from professors, maybe some kind of research statement, proposal, and often you also have to do a test. Well, you guys probably do not have to do an English test, but something else like the GRE or something. And then if your test is good enough, especially the top schools, they have tough requirements. I remember that. But if that is all good enough, and of course this is also very important for people to understand. They often forget this. And if there's anyone in your audience who thinks about doing a PhD abroad or an MPhil, is to always find a professor first at that school who is interested in your topic, or you are interested in that professor's topic. Maybe that professor does something in a field that you also find very interesting. Write to that professor, see if she or he or anything is interested in the topic that you want to study with that professor, and then when you apply, make sure to write the name of that professor in your application and say that you are looking forward to working with that person. Once you have agreement from the person, that really helps for you to get in. So that's just a little advice.
Yeah, I would say that's a little hidden gem that a lot of applicants don't know about. But yeah, if they see, especially that you've done your research about their research, and you mention them in your essay, and that you want to work with them, that's actually a big plus as someone who's been on the admissions side. That's a good one to mention. I do have to ask about politics, because I'm curious. This is something I didn't really talk to my students about because I didn't want them to feel uncomfortable or awkward, but because I tend to be pretty far left. But in reference to like what you see in China and like with your students as well, are they aware of what's going on politically right now in the United States? Like, are they aware of just how horrible like Joe Biden is? I'm just curious.
That's a really good question. I mean, there are so many surprises in China, at least for me, and probably for the people watching as well. Like, for instance, there's a great article I would recommend called Trumpism or Beaconism and the Trumpian Metamorphosis of Chinese Liberal Intellectuals. It's all about how liberals in China, and by liberal, I mean they want capitalist democracy, or free markets and free elections. A lot of them became huge Trump fans and adopted a lot of the positions of the right in the U.S., like against affirmative action, against Black Lives Matter, because in their minds, Trump was kind of like a beacon of liberalism, like free markets and free elections. Boom, he's hated, but the people that hate him are suspect because he stands for liberalism. But that's, those are liberal intellectuals. Then you also have neo-Maoists, or the new left in China, that want a return to a more state-driven economic system where economic equality is given preeminence. So there's all sorts of different kind of ideological currents going on within China today. In terms of the actual policy, like I would basically describe it as fairly conservative state developmentalist regime. Like the primary goal is developing the country, getting it into a position where it can no longer be crushed. People in the US don't have a good sense for this because their country can't be crushed. There isn't any country in the world that could cripple it with an economic sanction regime, or even there isn't any alliance of countries that could do any serious harm to the US. That's a strange case in the world. Most countries in the world do have the threat of being crushed, and if you're not in, the club, like the Chinese government isn't, then that threat is even more worrisome. So I think that explains the kind of conservatism, and it's a strange conservatism too. I mean, it's conservative in the sense that they don't do rapid changes across the country like that. They do a lot of policy experimentation. So like in individual provinces, they'll experiment with a new policy. They'll see how it goes. And then if it works well, they'll expand it to a couple extra provinces. And if it works well there, they'll expand it to the whole country. It's a highly decentralized system. That's another thing most people don't know about China. They assume it's like a completely, it's dominated entirely by the central government. That's not the way it works at all. It's a very decentralized government where provincial level governments have a lot of power. But on the other hand, to balance out that kind of conservatism, that desire not to change things very fast, there's also very hopeful signs in that, over the past year, the crackdown on private educational institutions, the crackdown on big tech firms. These are the sorts of things I was joking at the time. I'm like, hold on, is Xi Jinping Elizabeth Warren? Like, a lot of the stuff that came out of China this past year, could have been repackaged in Warrenite kind of political discourse. Like, we want to control the power of big tech, et cetera. But most importantly, I think, is the fact that the Chinese government has invested more in renewable energy than any other government in the world, and is the primary reason why solar power prices are so low, because there was such massive government investment. People in the US, they think of Solyndra, this like big scandal from the Obama administration where they gave like a couple $100 million in guaranteed loans to some solar power company that didn't do very well and wasn't able to pay them back. And that was like a big scandal in the US. Whereas China has just been pouring multiples of that amount of money into the solar industry. And of course, lots of those investments don't work out. That's the nature of investing in this kind of major project. But because of what they've done, solar power is cheaper than even coal by some estimates. And if that continues, then so basically, if those two trends continue, I would be very bullish on China's future.
Yeah, and you can definitely ask these questions to us, Sabrina, because I think we are just as extremely left on the spectrum as you are, so that won't be a problem. But yeah, I agree with Peter that there is such an ideological diversity in China. Like in the West, like I always say, in the West we have historically tended to lump all human beings that were not Western together and as one big amorphous blob. But there is just as much diversity as anywhere else. And even in my class, I have students who are critical of the Chinese economic system, and I have students who are celebratory of the Chinese economic system, and I have students who are on one position where it comes to the Hong Kong protests, and students who are on the other position at the Hong Kong protests. But I think in general, students do increasingly how can I say that? Increasingly see that the US is not really a force for good in the world, and also not towards China in particular. And I think what Peter said is also very important, also for your audience to understand. The US and the West in general has this tendency to demonize China. Oh, China is very authoritarian. China, if you go there, you lose all your freedom, blah, 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 blah. But you must understand something. Every society that opened up its political system and its market got dominated by the most powerful countries in the world, the US, and it became a puppet state. It's very simple. The US has so much capital that when you open up your market and your political system, you throw in capital from the US and you just manipulate the society to what you want. So the Chinese must close off to compete in that race, to finally be treated as equal human beings. So that is one important aspect. And another important aspect is, of course, what is freedom? I always say, in one case, you have the freedom to say F the president, okay? But at the same time, you have to walk on bare feet under a bridge because you cannot afford housing and healthcare. Or you have a place where you cannot say F the president, but you have housing, you have healthcare, you can feed your family, and you have a job. You know what? I would choose for the latter, to be very honest. It may sound weird because we in the West are so indoctrinated about freedom, freedom, freedom. I must say what I want. I must say what I want. But actually here they are more like, I want to get what I want, and I don't need to say what I want per se. You know what I mean? That doesn't mean that you cannot be critical here. You have a media system, seriously, that writes critical about economic policies, about foreign policy, and so forth. It's just not that same kind of radical freedom that we have in the West. And like I said before, there is a reason why China has to watch out opening up like that, because before you know, capital comes in and really reshapes society.
Yeah, as Fidel Castro said when the Council on Foreign Relations was having a Q&A when he was visiting New York, he said, you think the people of Cuba would rather have habeas corpus or a plate of beans? Like, you can go down to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. First, you need security. You need life. You need to provide the basics for society. Then you can start providing the higher order human needs. But that being said, like the last research I read about this, and things that may have changed in the preceding years, but last research I saw about this, they posted all sorts of posts on Chinese social media. And a lot of them were like, very critical of the government, screw screw Xi Jinping, screw the party, they're all bad, blah, blah, blah. Those weren't taken down. The only ones that were taken down were attempts to meet up and form organizations in real life. So I think that's that demonstrates the kind of the thinking of the Chinese government. They want stability overall because their primary goal is development to the point where they can no longer be crushed with the boot under their neck. So development requires stability. They don't want like organizations that are out of their control and might actually be controlled by foreign powers, causing interruptions to economic production, breaking down social order in places. I'm just explaining the way that they're thinking. I ideologically, I'm a Democrat. Like I would want to see real democracy, but I recognize as a real Democrat, as an ideological Democrat, that there isn't real democracy in many places in the world. And the conditions that democracy requires don't obtain in most of the world, but they're still worthwhile to aim for. But when you're dealing with countries that don't have a full range of movement because they're weak relative to the hegemon, well, then you've got to think slightly differently.
Well said. Eric, I'm ready for those comments on Rockfin. Thanks so much, Roger Meadows, for the tip on Rockfin. Reason why we have two separate set of K through 12 public education in the US is because we push it on to homeowners to pay for it via the property tax. Then in prison parents who put their children in another district, they don't own property in because they see it as you are free riding. Yet the federal government, with all its vast unlimited resources, since we are currency issuers, put in less than 10%. If the Fed did 90%, state 10%, we'd reverse this. Thanks so much for that, Roger.
Yeah, right on. I mean, yeah, that's I'd say the primary problem in the U.S. school system. The reason why, like, average grades on international tests get dropped down, it's because of all of these poor districts that have very poorly working school systems. Even more important, arguably, is the fact that parents in these poor areas, they're stressed out. They have more cortisol running through their veins every single day because they're economically marginal and weak, and they know that if they lose their job, they're in huge trouble. They have to work several jobs. So it's a combination of those things. But I would likewise point towards the insane system of property tax funding as the primary one.
Agreed. I would also say too, in reference to the higher education system, one of the things that I've noticed when looking at schools abroad and looking at schools here, a lot of times, well, I guess I would say PhD programs. I noticed that like in the UK and in Germany, you could go to some of those PhD programs for just 3 years. But yet here in the United States, we had to tell students 5 to 7 years. And when I was at MIT, when I told students at MIT, I'm like 5 to 7 years, it's probably going to be 7 years, like just realistically because of the research. And I used to think to myself, like, are there ways that we could change that in the United States? And I thought about the first 2 years that I was in undergrad, taking all these classes that really had nothing to do with my major, but we had to take them because they were core requirement classes. Well, if they eliminated those and just had us go straight into our field of interest, our major, that also would help with student loan debt in this country. So I have to ask, like, what's your opinion about that? Like some of the countries like the UK and Germany, where you can go get like a PhD for like 3 years. Do you feel that's the better way to go? Or do you feel like you do need more years of education?
Yeah, I'm actually on the other side with my opinion. I think 3 years is too little for a PhD. Don't do that. That's really problematic. In Hong Kong, you also have in certain cases that you can do it in 3 years when you already have an MPhil, and pretty much all of them either suffer tremendously or they defer 1 or 2 years. A PhD is tough. Fact, if you ever want to get a PhD, then make sure you're really interested in gaining knowledge and building knowledge, because it's going to be really tough. And it should be, because in the end, if you have a PhD, you should be able to teach some of the most intelligent people from all around the world. So I think it should be tough. So I don't think solutions, that was what we always do in capitalism, solutions should be cutting things, like how do you call that, austerity kind of thinking, cutting. No. We should not cut things. We should make things more for human beings. We just should pay for it. It's very simple. Just pay for it. As a society, there is nothing in the United States that keeps it from paying for its society. But the problem is, once you do that, you don't have cheap labor anymore, and you don't have cheap soldiers anymore. So what do? You make people on the brink, living on the brink of society. So you have easy, cheap labor to exploit and easy soldiers to exploit. I think that's one of the biggest reasons why it's not happening in the United States, because you guys have enough money to give everybody fantastic schooling, and it has a tremendous effect on the society in the Netherlands as well. Like people from all layers of society can go to university, can study. And what you see is that even when you come from very poor families, you are using that talent. And that talent later on builds your society. So you get a knowledge economy, like we had in the Netherlands. And a knowledge economy that makes your society grow, and you get more and more entrepreneurialism, you get academics, it has such a tremendous effect over the course of many, many years, when you really make use of all that talent you have in your society. I think that is so important, and that is so lacking in the United States. All that fantastic talent, in these poor neighborhoods and these poor areas and these poor villages, who are just spending their fantastic brain. All the people, every human being has so much talent, and it's being used as robots in cheap labor factories, or as cannon fodder in the army. I find it very, very saddening, the thought about that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like George Carlin said, the reason why education will never be fixed in the US is that the rulers don't want that. The rulers want an educational system where people are kept just smart enough to run all the machinery and do all the paperwork, but just dumb enough not to be able to realize how they've gotten screwed by a system that threw them overboard 40 fucking years ago. Now it would be like 50 years ago. But yeah, I agree on that. And then on the question of education, like I'm all for college for all, but not just as a free college option, but as college should be mandatory. Like everyone, should finish their education at university, not high school. And the discussion, like the MMT perspective, is really important here because, like Fidel was pointing out, it's primarily a perspective that refocuses our attention away from monetary figures and taxation revenue towards real resources. And then when we start thinking about real resources instead on the question of higher education, then it's much more illuminating. What are the real resources that you need to provide higher education to everyone? So to give everyone a college degree in the same way that today we give everyone a high school degree. Well, it requires buildings to have the classes in, buildings for universities. It requires teachers. And then in science, it requires, some equipment, et cetera. But we're not talking about a major resource requirement. This isn't like, building a Ferrari for every family. Then you're dealing with a lot of steel, a lot of rare earth metals, a lot of engineering energy to put it together. When you're talking about providing education for everyone, that's actually relatively easy. As long as you have an excess population, or a population that is not currently employed in something that's essential, and the US has plenty of extra people who could be doing something else. And then just have to build more university space, more buildings. Those are the two main resources. So that's, I think, another reason why the MMT perspective is really helpful, because otherwise you just look at monetary figures, and monetary figures hide the real resource use.
I'd also add too, like I've seen the way that universities sometimes spend money, and sometimes I feel like it's spent in ways that we could do without. Like we don't need gold elevator doors. We don't have to have all these fancy like classrooms. I mean, yes, we need the technology, but I've seen universities just like throw money away in ways that money could have been used for better things, I think. And I'd really like to see universities in the United States increase the PhD stipend. There are kids going to these schools in like New York City and Boston, and the stipend's like $35,000 and they can't work. And I'm like, that's really hard to live off of here. So I wish they would do that too, but I know that's more on a federal level, like not necessarily by the university.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. The stipend in Hong Kong is pretty good, and especially when you get an added government scholarship, then it's really, really good. But I agree with you. That's really, really necessary to get enough money during your PhD. Otherwise, again, otherwise it becomes very much of an elite issue. Only the rich can get their proper education, and the rest of the society is just struggling to get by.
There's a question here about international food labeling. Is there high fructose corn syrup in foods? Do they list everything? My Filipino teacher brought candy from his country and it had 3 or 4 ingredients.
Yeah, same as in Hong Kong, but also when I lived in Malaysia for 3 years, it's pretty much the same as in Europe. Yeah, you have biological foods supermarkets, you have the normal supermarkets, and the labeling is, in my opinion, exactly identical to what I'm used to in Europe. Maybe Peter, well, you're from the US.
Not what I'm used to in the US, because the US has such lax food regulations that they're allowed to put stuff in especially processed food that you wouldn't be able to feed like pigs in the EU. Makeup is another area where there's all sorts of chemicals allowed in makeup sold in the US that is illegal in the EU. So I don't know much about the labeling here, other than they put an extra sticker on it if it isn't in English and Chinese, but I don't know much more beyond that. Or just the fact that there aren't anywhere near as many obese people here, which does speak to a food system that is better designed for human health, whereas the U.S. food system is perfectly designed just for corporate profit. So whatever you hire some scientists that come up with exactly the amount of salt and fat and sugar that you put in something to make it as addictive as possible, and go right into the market, sir. There's just no restrictions there. And I think that's probably the number one reason why there's such an obesity epidemic in the US, because we don't give a damn about our people. We care more about the ability of our agribusiness corporations to make a profit.
Yeah, that takes me back to the health question as well. Americans we're typically unhealthy. Just as a whole, on average, Americans are unhealthy when you compare us to other countries in the world. And one of the things that people have asked is well, why is that? And I know from my experience, when I lived in Europe, it just seemed like people there were more active. I remember going to Denmark with my dad. Everybody was riding bikes, like the way that we drive cars. They had bike lanes, and this is before that was a popular thing here. It's becoming more popular here now, but this was years ago. And I just remember people just seem to be more active. Whereas here, especially out in the suburban areas, you have to have a car, right? So everybody gets into their cars, they go into the store, they get back into their car, and we're just not as active. I feel like that's part of it. But then you can go to countries like France, and some of the items on the menu are very rich and fattening. And I said, but they also don't work the way that we do. They don't work 60, 70-hour weeks for little pay. And so I think all these things are combined. And then it takes me back to the healthcare system, that some of these countries, everybody has healthcare, universal healthcare, and we don't have that here. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point. I think you really must connect that to the quality of living of people in the United States. If you don't have a lot of money, you cannot buy good foods. You cannot survive on good foods. So these processed foods become actually your normal staple foods to survive. You know what I mean? So obesity, even among people who work hard, becomes a big problem. In the Netherlands is even worse than Denmark. The Netherlands is the bicycle country of the world. It's ridiculous. You see bicycles everywhere. Bicycle is like walking. You start doing it as a kid when you're 2 years old. And that definitely plays a huge role. Yet, here you go. Yeah, Ramsey. Same with me. I grew up on a bicycle, like everything, to school, to friends, always on bicycle, even to the bars, drinking, then drunk on your bicycle back to your house. Good memories. But still, if you go to Hong Kong, you will be amazed by how little obesity you see here. These people are all just slim and in such good shape, and they eat well. I mean, they eat bowls of rice and meat and everything, but just so obesity is just such an almost non-existent here. It's really, really amazing. What it exactly is, I think maybe a bit of the genetics, but also maybe a balanced meals. I don't know, but it's even more impressive than what I see in my own country.
Yeah, and a lot of people go hiking here because there's so many mountains to go hiking. It's probably like the most popular leisure activity other than going to malls. But Sabby, you also mentioned an important part of that puzzle of why obesity is such a problem and health issues are such a problem in general in the U.S. And it's, I think, linked to, why is it that poor people live shorter lives than rich people, and why is there like a life expectancy gap between European American and Afro Americans in the U.S.? Well, it's primarily poverty. When you're in poverty, you're dealing with constant stress every day. So your cortisol levels, the stress hormone, are higher. Your risk of heart disease, which is probably the biggest killer, is far higher when you're poor. And it's because you don't have any control over your life. You're not in a managerial position. You're being managed by somebody else. You don't have job security. You're always on a knife's edge. If you have to constantly worry about, okay, how much does this cost? Can I afford this? If I buy this, can I buy that at the end of the month? Can I pay my rent if I also have to, all of these thoughts, they take up a lot of our brain's processing power, but they also increase the amount of stress we feel. And the more stress and cortisol we have running through our system, the more that comfort food literally comforts us. So I think, yeah, that's another really important part of the picture of why are people so unhealthy, in addition to, the lack of a real healthcare system, in addition to the fact that, there's no food regulations worth their name. It's all just whatever makes the most money for agribusiness. But yeah, that's another big part of the picture.
Thanks so much, Meteor Dreams, for the super chat. How come some Latinos in the U.S. are considered white? Oh, I wish
Well,
Josana was here for that.
that's a very easy answer. I'm going to answer it. It's because these were descendants from the similar people who went to North America, the ones who went to Latin America. These were Europeans. European white colonists did not only go to North America, they also went to Latin America to colonize the continent. So that's why a lot of Latin Americans look white, because they are white, just like white Americans. And then you have Latin Americans who don't look white because they are from they are descendants of the indigenous Latin Americans or the Afro Latin Americans who were imported. So people always, it surprises me so much in America that they like, often you also see that white Latin Americans who are often right-wing and pro-capitalism, they make use of this idea. Look, we are people of color. We support capitalism. We support the Republican Party. No, you're not people of color. You are Euro Latin Americans. You know what I mean? And Euro Latinos. Yeah, how do you want to call them? So if you had, like, to give you an example, one of my best friends is Brazilian. Okay, born in Brazil. Okay, blonde hair, light blue eyes, as white can be. He cannot get a tan. He's a Latino, you know what I mean? He's Latin American, but he's a descendant of the colonizers back in the day in Brazil, of Belgium. He's of Belgian and Germanic descent, German descent. So when people say like Latin Americans are cannot be white, yes, they can. They're just like the guys in the United States. They came there with ships. In the north, in Canada and the US, and in the south, in countries like Brazil and Guatemala and you name it, in Mexico. And those are white people, or at least what we classify as white. That's it.
Yeah, the US racial classification system is so stupid, but I guess all racial classification systems are fundamentally stupid because they're based on a pseudoscience of race. But yeah, that's one of the funnier examples where you can be like, from a massive landowning family anywhere south of the U.S. border, and trace your descendants straight back to Spain or Germany or what have you. But then as soon as you cross the border to the U.S., you're a Latino. But it's just a stupid classification system that hopefully we can get rid of one day once we fix the matters of power imbalances and inequality. But yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example of just how dumb it is.
Agreed. This is an important point. There are Afro Latinos. The media always show the light skinned ones, and that happens in other countries as well. I have a friend who's from India, and she said the same thing back home. She said where she lives in India, most people have darker skin like her. But if you turn on the TV, most of the people you'll see, especially like in the Bollywood movies, are lighter skin. I'm gonna do a whole other like stream on colorism because it happens. It's not just in the United States. It happens in other countries as well. It happens in Thailand. It happens in India. It's important for people to know about that.
Yeah, so if I can quickly jump in, Sabby, if you allow me to.
Mhm.
So I have written a paper about this in cultural psychology about colorism and how colorism is literally a global phenomenon. Okay, colorism is global, most part due to colonialism, because colonialism was global, and also due to classist hierarchies that you had in certain societies. I think about India or China. But the colonialism was one of the most severe, impactful events on global colorism. And indeed, it's really, really saddening to see those who are being represented. I always talk about that. Those who are being represented, whether you are in Turkey, whether you are in Hong Kong, whether you are in Latin America, the people you see on television most often have a light-skinned and preferably Euro phenotype. You know what I mean? And that is all rooted in colonialism. It's that kind of mindset that we have to crawl out, thinking that one group of people is the norm and is representative. So very, very good observation, definitely.
Yeah, it's very true. There's a documentary called I don't know if it's still on Netflix. I have to double check. But there's a documentary oh my gosh, what's the guy's name? The professor at Harvard, him and Obama, or a police officer tried to arrest him because he was breaking into his own house. Henry Gates, yeah, okay. He did a documentary a while back about the Dominican Republic, and he went there and he was talking about like the colorism and how like they basically tried to erase the African history out the country. It's really important. I'm gonna see if I can find it and I'll give you guys the link because I think everybody should watch that. It happens all across the world.
And notice one thing, and notice in all these societies, and this is so important to understand for people. Notice how the ruling class in these societies is pretty much 90% of the time light-skinned. It's all over the world. The ruling class is light-skinned. Think about that. Where does that ruling class come from? We have to go into history. Who were those people? These were people often descendants of colonizers, or of the high classes like you see in Asia, who also maintain light skin by staying out of the sun and all that kind of stuff. But okay, that's a different discussion. Otherwise, I go on too long.
Yeah, and you even have like straight up real racism, like in the sense that people who believe that race is real and they think that their race is superior. In the genocide in Guatemala, which the U.S. government played a big role in supporting. But there it was the light-skinned Spaniard descendant elites in the main capital city waging a genocidal war against the Indian population in the countryside. And so you have colorism and you still have like classic racism, like real racism with some absolutely horrendous consequences. Also like in Colombia, lots of places in Latin America.
Agreed. Thank you so much for the super chat, Meteor Dreams. Karim, Puerto Ricans and Cubans and Venezuelans think they are white, and they always look down on Central Americans, even though Puerto Ricans are brown too.
And I would call that Meteor Dreams. I would call that the saddening and deeply painful effect of the history of colonialism that has so strongly internalized in a lot of people their own inferiority that they do everything to wash away what makes them identify as a group that has historically been portrayed as subhuman or inferior. And you see the same in the Arab world. Okay, when you see the Middle East and among Syrians, Lebanese, these are very in general quite white Arabs. Okay, these are Arabs that could walk around in Northern Europe and they would not stand out. And even there, you have these people who say like, when the media in the West is talking about the barbaric Middle East and the axis of evil, you even have people there saying like, yeah, but that's the darker skin colored ones. These are more traditional. These are more dogmatic. Okay, that is that severe internalized colonialism that you see all over the world in both people who are of light skin and people who are of dark skin. that's why I always say colorism and white supremacy and colonialism are one of the biggest evils that have been done to mankind in history, because it's so visible. We cannot escape it. You know what I mean? I find it one of the biggest evils that has been done in human history.
Thank you so much for the super chat, intermediary fossil. Will humanity make it past the red giant phase of the sun? Also, thank you so much for the super chat. Also, what do you do for a living? Because I noticed you said like $50 super chats. Thank you so much.
I'm more worried about getting past like the next 100 years. But yeah, if we can make it past the next 100 years, then sure, I think we could create an actual civilization on this planet and survive until we have to get the hell off because the sun is getting too big. But right now, I'm just focused on the ecological crisis that we're in, that we don't seem to be doing anywhere near the amount that's required to prevent catastrophe from hitting, which could literally unravel human civilization in this century. Like a lot of people, they just look at the first order effects of climate change and the broader ecological crisis. So they're like, oh yeah, coastal cities are going to get flooded and storms will be worse, blah, blah, blah. And it'll be hotter during the summer. So if you're old, it's going to be dangerous for you, blah, blah, blah. But those first order effects are not the ones that you should be worried about. You should be worried about the second order effects. What happens when you have reduced rainfall in the breadbasket of India, and you have much less food production going on because of the changes in weather. And then you have, revolutions, mass migrations, wars starting over water. That's the thing to really worry about. So that, if we can get past that in this century, then sure, like I think we can go a long way.
Plus the complex interactions between all the variables that we cannot even explain, that is just too complex for a human brain. And think about viruses and climate and temperature and food production, all these things together. There's so many correlations between all these variables that we could just not fathom, that I think we don't even realize the shitstorm that is coming. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why like the fundamental restructuring of the global economic system is exactly what's needed and nothing less. Precisely because of all of these complex interrelations. Like we understand the ecological crisis and its various component parts. We can see like relationships of how the Gulf Stream gets interrupted and then Europe becomes extremely cold. We can see these little things, but the possibilities of positive feedback loops and tipping points are more complex than we can really grapple with. So the only thing that we can do and we must do is completely restructure the global economic system for long-term sustainability. But good luck that happening under Biden. I love how like the climate spending of $55 billion a year. I think it was Kate Aronoff who pointed this out. Like that's approximately half of the amount of money that U.S. people spend on pets every year. Half. So yeah, that's not a restructuring.
Wow. I was talking to Professor Wolf, and one of the things that he said is that if you look at the way that people rose up in France, the yellow vests, how they fought back, why don't we have that type of, well, I'll start with you, Peter. Why don't we have that type of movement here in the United States? Like, what do you think it would take to get Americans to get that fired up as people are in France, or as people were in the Netherlands about the mandates? Like, why do you feel we just don't have that here?
Well, that's the topic of my book. It's the media. It's begins and ends with the media. If you have a lot of people in the US, in Europe, in Brazil, lots of places in the world that are rightly dissatisfied with the current order, they realize things are screwed up. They realize that something fundamentally needs to change. But the political economic system is extremely complex. How are you supposed to figure that out if you're just on your own and you go to the most easily accessible sources of information that do provide you with an explanation? Well, in the US, we have a very vibrant right-wing media ecosystem, tons of outlets. They reach tens of millions of people. Radio, television, these are all easy media to just click a button and boom, you're getting it. Where is our left media? it barely exists. Like we've got a little bit of left media on YouTube. We've got a little bit of left media in like the magazine space. There's like Democracy Now!, which is on a few cable channels, but we're all talking about outlets that reach thousands, tens of thousands. If we're lucky, maybe 100,000 views for a few videos. This is a drop in the bucket. So that's the fundamental reason why you don't have, in my view, any kind of movement in the US. And until we have a way of getting information into people's heads, and it doesn't necessarily have to be through modern mass media. Like if we realize that, look, we don't have the money to buy a cable channel or a broadcast TV network across the US where we could really get into millions and millions of households. If we don't have that, well, what do we have? We do have people. And if we organized ourselves to spread ideas like, organizing mutual aid groups where educating people is a primary goal. It's not just we're going to be I think Catherine Liu puts it this way, a Band-Aid for neoliberalism. Like the state has withdrawn from society, so we're going to create mutual aid groups that provide for the needs that the state has retreated from. No, that too, but the number one thing has to be educating people, because if we had our ideas in tens of millions of people's heads, then there's no limit to what we could do. But until we get more information out, more ideas, our narrative, our explanation for why things are screwed up and what we could do to fix it, until we do that, then we're not going to, see anything other than completely unpredictable, maybe outbreaks over an individual, occurrence, like the George Floyd protests. I could never have predicted those because we didn't have organizations that were ready to launch a nationwide protest movement. But this video comes out of this atrocity, and it inspires enough people to come out. So that sort of thing can still happen. But when it comes to completely restructuring the political system and the economic system, which is what we need, that I don't have much faith in these kinds of like flash in the pan, unpredictable movements without any sort of organization. We need tens of millions of people who have the same ideas in their heads, and that's what we're lacking.
Yeah, and this is such a good point that Peter makes, and I want to jump in on that, is the fact that we have this tendency to talk about France and to talk about the Netherlands. I rather talk about India. I think that was a much more successful kind of anti-neoliberal protest, because Peter makes such a good point there. In the West, these protests are most often, these social movements are most often hijacked by the right. They are so successfully hijacked by the right through the mass media system that is controlled by the oligarchy. In the Netherlands, in France, everywhere. So even the yellow vests, they may be anti-Macron or whatever, but they are so susceptible, a large part, to be mobilized for racist ends, and blame immigrants, for example. You see the same in the Netherlands with these protests. A huge chunk are being convinced by super racist right-wing rhetoric. Why? Because they mobilize that anger into right-wing kind of thinking, hateful thinking. You had it with Nazi Germany. You had it in Yugoslavia. You have it now in Europe. Why? Because we keep staying in that horrible system of capitalism where the oligarchy rather blames another group than that social movements organize against the right group of people. That's very dangerous. So it's always mobilized for right-wing ends. And I think India was a very unique example where 250 million people organized against, well, you could say the oligarchy, something that is very, very, very unique.
Yeah, and that example shows like a little ray of hope, because the media system in India is if anything, even worse than the US. Like it is completely captured by the right wing, as is the government. But because this is my best guess, because they have still remaining in India labor union networks and organizations that can just get around the propaganda apparatus. Of course, the propaganda apparatus is going to work on, let's say, even a majority of the population. They're going to believe that the farmers are trying to destroy India and they're anti-Indian and they're like a Pakistani, secret operation or some bullshit like that. But because you have real world organizations, you've got another network for information to transmit, so that you can have millions of people that don't believe the media narrative and organize and successfully win. But we need to get ideas into people's heads, and that's where we have to play catch up.
Ja'Cory Arthur said there are plenty of political advocacy organizations, but they are all disjointed. Who do you all think is most impactful?
If we're talking about the U.S., impact, I mean, that's tough. And that is the problem. You've got so many different organizations, but they're all separated. They're not all unified under a unitary kind of command structure so that we could really leverage the minority that we are on the left, the maximum number of people, leverage them to act as a unified whole. Yeah, that is a huge problem. But what I would say is we need numbers. We need the biggest possible organization. So I would look at just the numbers and be like, okay, well, DSA, 50,000, 60,000 people who at least sent in money so that they could, be called members. That's the kind of organization you want to focus on to take over. You can criticize the hell out of it, and all of the criticisms I've heard, land. They make sense to me. But the bottom line is we need numbers. So you can focus on taking over organizations, and don't be like a wimp when it's we failed one time. Yeah, of course, you're on the left. It's in our history, our DNA to fail. We fail, and then finally we succeed. But keep trying at taking over an organization that at least has a lot of passive members. And I would even go further to say taking over the Democratic Party should be a goal. It's not easy, but it's relatively easier than starting a new party, which I think is also good. But taking over the Democratic Party, why is that important? Because you have to recognize we are a tiny minority. The number of people who have the same basic understanding of how the world works, who knows what imperialism is, the number of people who have a conception that the US military constitutes an empire is so tiny. We are a tiny minority. But there's a lot of know-nothings, people who don't really know that much about politics, but because they grew up in a Democrat household, they're just going to vote D every time they go into the voting booth. So take advantage of that. So basically what I'm saying is we should aim high to take over existing organizations, or if you can grow one and get to the level of tens of thousands, ideally hundreds of thousands of people, great. I would just say all of the above strategy. But it disheartens me when I see people saying we tried to take over the Democratic Party. How did that work out? It didn't work out. It failed. But that doesn't mean you just give up and you try to do something that has an even lower percentage chance of success. Because if you're going to get a third party to win, you need to replicate what the Democratic Party has already done over 2 centuries, which is to get lots of people who are not politically knowledgeable, who are not politically active or aware, to just reflexively go into the booth and vote for you. So I would say all of the above, but we need to be thinking about having a mass organization.
Oh, Peter, I wasn't going to bring up the Democratic Party. I wasn't going to go there. But since you went there, I actually disagree with that, because I feel like with the 2-party system, in order for things to work, you need to get the money completely out. And I feel like until that happens, we're not going to see progress. And I think this is why some of us are so disappointed with people like AOC and the rest of the squad, because they ran on Medicare for all. They ran on these issues that were supposed to be progressive issues. And then they got into office and then they went along with the establishment Democrats. But again, that's the thing. It's they're supposed to change the party, but you don't change the party changes you. So I feel like until you get rid of all these corporations that are connected to these politicians, like the student loan companies, which is why they won't cancel student loan debt. They donate to Democrats and Republicans. You have to get rid of them until you get the money out from Lockheed Martin. You have to get the money out from Raytheon. That's another big one. The list goes on, but they donate to both parties. So this is why I tell people it doesn't matter who you put in, whether it's Democrat or Republican. If they're going into the 2-party system, they end up caving in. And the few that did not, they pushed them out. Like Cynthia McKinney, they pushed her out. Look at what they did to Ralph Nader. So they don't keep those people. So I think you have to get the money completely out, and then maybe something could happen and change there. But I hear you. I'm just saying, I wasn't going to go there, but
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you said. I think everything you said is absolutely correct. My question is just, how do we get the money out of politics? If we had a third party that could get tens of millions of people to vote for it, absolutely, that's a great way. That's actually a preferable way. I would like to see both of the other parties just die. But if we can't get that, then the next easiest option is primary everyone. So like primary AOC, sure, but she's nowhere near like the top of the list of people that need to be primary. We need to decimate the party and completely take it over. So like that's a tall order. It's, I think, less of a shorter order than starting a new party, but it doesn't really matter to me. The point is we have to gain power one way or another. So if you're going to go the third party route, fine, but make sure that you understand the game you're playing, and you have to get tens of millions of people on board. If you can't get that, Democratic primary elections are relatively easier, as hard as they are, as stacked as the deck is, as much of an uphill battle that is relatively less than winning in a general election with a party that nobody's heard of if you don't get that information to people's heads. It's still plenty hard to win at a primary level, but a primary level, people, what is it? It's like 10 to 20% of eligible voters vote in primaries. In a general election, somewhere around 50 to 60% of people will vote. Then you're dealing with many more people who don't know anything. And if you don't have, a TV station or a radio network, how do you get that idea of this new party into tens of millions of people's heads? Whereas if your battle is in primary elections, you're dealing with 10 to 20% of the electorate. It's still plenty hard. I'm not trying to say that that's easy. And we have good experience of electing like a handful of people. And then when this handful of people enters the meat grinder, they get ground up mostly. But just a last point on that, I was a little suspicious about when AOC was running, what did we as a left think about her? Did we do due diligence and really pepper her to see what her ideology was and how strong it was and how well developed it was? I can only speak for myself. I didn't do that. I was relying on the judgments of a lot of other people who said, yep, she's good, she's left. Her rhetoric is excellent, but I don't know how well formed and how solid her ideology was. And when I see some of the things that happened, like when the coup in Bolivia was going on, and then she met with some right-wing members of right-wing people in Bolivia who were pro-coup, and I just saw that as this is an ignorant person. This is a person who has a good heart, who sees, oh, somebody from Bolivia, they're Latino, I'm going to meet with them. They're the wretched of the earth. And not doing your due diligence and not learning what the political reality in Bolivia is. I just don't think that her ideology was ever, as strong as people assumed it was. But anyway, sorry, that was kind of a side point.
No, I think you both say something very interesting here. Sabrina says, okay, we have to get money out of politics. Peter says, yeah, but how do we get money out of politics? And we need media. You know who gives me hope? And I think maybe both of you have already seen it. I just saw it yesterday, a very, very good interview with Kshama Sawant and Chris Hedges on Brianna Joy Gray's podcast. And I'm such a huge fan of Kshama Sawant. Mm-hmm. And of course, also Chris Hedges. I love his books and the way he's a real pessimist, but a beautiful pessimist, the way he speaks. And someone like Kshama Sawant really, really makes me hopeful. This lady is such a just amazing person, because what does she do? How do you say that in English? Can you say she swears off money like a big salary? So she's already now, once she can get more money, she swears off like a part of her salary to show she's a socialist. She only does it for socialism, for Marxism. And when you have a group of people like Kshama Sawant, they are not going to be bought off. Okay, she's now already doing part of her money away. And she also says that in that interview, you must get a team like those people together. In the Netherlands, we have a socialist party where also you can only become part of the party if part of your salary is being given to the party. So the party can promote itself, can buy ads on the media and that stuff. So here you have what Peter and Sabrina both said. You need a team that are not bought off like Kshama Sawant, that put part of their money in the big bowl of the party and use that to promote to use that to promote yourself on networks and stuff. In the Netherlands, it was very successful. Socialist Party became very big. So I think that somebody like Shama Sawant, and if you can find it to create a team, because I think it was in Seattle, I'm not sure. She just beat some recall effort from the oligarchy there. So you see, she has power. Imagine that in multiple parts of the United States, and eventually building into a great movement where you only have people who are not going to get the money. They don't need it. If you immediately are willing to pay part of your salary away, you're not going to be somebody who's going to be bought off. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, totally different. That's just a woman who is in there for the idolization and the fame. I mean, I remember that video. You remember that video where she's like, so what about? She's standing there, and then somebody's really asking her a question, and she's like, yeah, we're going to talk about that later. Just like Nancy Pelosi, that arrogance, we're going to talk about that later. And I immediately in that moment, I saw this, forget it. This woman is not going to help you guys. That's not a socialist. Anyway, yeah.
The micro and the macro, and I forget what her word salad was, but yeah.
The how and the what when she was talking about Israel. Oh, that was so shameful. Yeah.
Yeah, I will add, like, Shama Sawant is amazing. Her group came on here twice, Socialist Alternative. In fact, if you're looking for a group to join, I recommend checking out Socialist Alternative. If you're like, don't want to do like Democratic Socialists of America, I know they've had like some issues, National DSA, but that doesn't mean the local chapters are necessarily that way, and that's important for people to know. I know the one here in Massachusetts, like, people tend to like DSA here in Massachusetts, so I've heard mostly it's the National DSA. But Socialist Alternative is a strong group. They came on here and they said, like, listen, like, she won because she didn't back down. She doesn't take the full salary. So people see she's the real deal. She does activism. And also, she didn't run through the Democratic Party. And I honestly, like, I want to see Shama Sawant on everyone's channel, like, seriously. But one thing I will say too, in reference to that, is local politics. And I think we should pay more attention to local politics as well, not just on a national level. Those of us that live in states that we can do ballot initiatives, this is how we've gotten things done here in Massachusetts. This is how we legalized marijuana. That was a ballot initiative. This is how we got ranked choice voting on the ballot. It was a ballot initiative. So some of these things, if you live in one of those states, and I'll have to put the list up at some point, if you live in one of those states, you need to get together with organizers in your state and come up with ballot initiatives and stop waiting on Joe Biden is never going to decriminalize marijuana federally. I'm sorry, I'm just telling you, you know how it is. He's funding the police state, so he's not going to take that. He's not going to give you that privilege, just being honest.
Yeah, and that could be a good way of building the kind of organization we need on a national level. Like, if we can win local political battles, that can be a good way of getting more people on our side locally, and then slowly networking to create a powerful national organization. So yeah, I'm all for that.
And then also, I would say, and Eric Thomas and I talked about this earlier tonight on RBN, Eric Thomas came up with a whole list of demands that for those of you who still want to do things through the Democratic Party, you need to demand things from these politicians. He came up with a whole list of them. And I think that's important. So if you didn't see that episode, definitely go back and watch that. It's called Solutions Panel. Franco and Nick were on that as well. But that's the thing. Like, what are our demands? We didn't even ask them for anything. Like, yes, like we repeated Bernie's talking points when he was like Medicare for all. But what do we want? What are our demands? And we shouldn't just ask for it during a presidential election. We should ask for it when it's not even election season. And I feel like we stopped asking. I feel like when Bernie suspended his campaign, that was it. It was like, okay, that's it. We should always ask for these things.
Yeah, and of course, the problem that we are living in this day and age, the social media celebrity culture, and I think in the United States and many other parts of the world, there are still. This sounds weird, but there are still too many people who are still too well off to not want to push their politicians to do radical change. If you see the amount of people who defend AOC, then I realize there's just not enough people who are in a bad enough situation, apparently, still. Because it's just amazing that you can let this lady just gaslight you all the time. I mean, beautiful words on Twitter. Why don't we have this? Why don't we have that? and then you don't vote for it. It's typical politician behavior. And yet there are people who will just cape for her and just like defend her at all costs. It's just so shocking to me. And that's idol power. That's the power of idol. You also see it with some commentators. Okay, some people cannot stand the fact, for example, that you critique someone like Jimmy Dore. You will get that same kind of rage from people. That's the kind of idol worshipping that has been created within our media spaces.
Yeah, and Karim, I think there's a powerful psychological phenomena going on there. Like, it was hard for everyone, I know myself included, over the past year and a half, to have, like, we came damn close to kind of using a cheat code of bypassing all of the kind of organization movement building you would otherwise normally need and kind of skip ahead into power through the Sanders campaign. And we came so close, and then when that failed, I think for a lot of people, it was just absolutely crushing, because what's the path forward? What is the hopeful idea we have now? Next, I don't need to go through how depressing it is, but I think for some people, it made them want to, like, find a hero in government that they could believe in, and just so then they have a powerful psychological drive to avoid the pain that would result in getting rid of their heroes or giving up on the squad or what have you. So you have that, I think, psychological drive. And then I think also you have, among the people who do see the squad as, coming in way under expectations, you also have like a kind of, we failed at this, at our last strategy of taking over the Democratic Party, so let's just do something else. But I don't see a lot of careful thought about what exactly is that something else, and what is our chance of achieving that? Are we evangelizing? Are we getting more people on our side to think like us? And I think, again, it's the desire to avoid the pain of recognizing that we are in an incredibly weak and perilous situation. And so instead of accepting that, either create a magical hero out of AOC, or take a kind of nihilistic, like, okay, we failed at the last thing we tried, so let's try something totally new that we haven't really thought through very closely what's required to achieve that. But that's just my speculation.
Well, I would say that at least it destroys, slowly eradicates all that kind of idealistical thinking that people had of politicians, because you do see a change. You see it, for example, with somebody like Nina Turner. A lot of people just don't believe in it anymore. And some people, some commentators on the left, in the left sphere, I won't name names because I think a lot of people are just great. I don't want to make people think that they're not. But some people would say that, well, we still have to give Nina Turner a chance and this and that within the machine. And regardless of the fact that she's a very, I like her a lot actually, but I agree with the people who just don't believe in that anymore. And you see that exploding, that sentiment. And personally, I think that's a good thing. I think you shouldn't believe in them anymore until they really, really show you what they're doing. Words are nothing in the political world. They're nothing. And you saw that with Joe Biden. It's one of the most shocking, blatant lying I've ever seen during a presidential campaign, and doing nothing after you get chosen. It's like, it's not even a little. You see it in the Netherlands too. They promise stuff, and some they do and some they don't, of course. So there's already lying, and you get a lot of anger about that. But what Biden did in the last presidential election, all these promises, just say yes, I'm going to do it all for you, yes, and nothing once he is chosen. You are being fooled so blatantly. It's just, it baffles me. How do you American people are still putting up with that stuff?
Agreed. And I would say, like, for African Americans, like, watching, if you're thinking about continuing to vote for the Democratic Party, again, if they're not running, if they're not offering some type of Black agenda, don't vote for them. Don't. We do this every time. I think sometimes we feel like we owe them our vote. We don't owe them our vote. We do all this for them. They don't do anything for us. So it's just
even that offer would be like, Biden could offer you a Black agenda. He would just lie about it. That's the problem. They would just lie about it.
That's true. It just, I feel like Ice Cube brought this up like in the 2020 election, and people just came after him on Twitter. And I'm like, what's wrong with what he said? It's true. Like, are we not supposed to ask for anything? Okay. I have
and that is that idol worshipping again. Eh? Sorry. Oh, Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was saying like exactly what you said about Ice Cube, who says a lot of great things, by the way. Really good stuff. And then I also don't understand that anger. And then you see the same kind of idol worshipping, that kind of attacking in my opinion, the wrong person. You know what I mean? Attacking the person who's trying to help you. You see that and you see it with AOC too. Like these people who are disappointed in AOC. Why are you not coming to the strike? Where are you? And then people are all angry at the people who are asking for help. You know, it's amazing.
I have a well said, Ja'Cory. Jim Crow Joe tricked tens of millions of people. I agree 100%. I have one more question for you guys. So at the end of the day, do you feel that life is better? Well, Peter, for you, do you feel that life is better abroad? Would you ever move back to the United States? And Karim, do you feel like life is better in Asia versus the Netherlands? And would you ever move back to the Netherlands?
Yes and no. So yes, I think life is better outside of the U.S. No, I don't have any plans on moving back. But so much of it depends on like what kind of niche you can find yourself abroad. It's not something you can just get on a plane and move somewhere and then just start something up. You do have to plan it out. But yeah, I in my view, life can be significantly better if you find yourself a good niche in another country.
Yeah, I agree with Peter in that sense. It's a very difficult question. In the first 5 years living abroad, I thought I'll never come back. Now we're 11 years further, almost 11 years, or 11 years exactly. And sometimes I feel like maybe not. One of the worst things I don't like about the West, and in my case, the Netherlands, but the West in general, I just hate the deep-rooted racism in our cultures. I just can't stand it. I can't take it. Even if it's not aimed at me personally, I can't stand opening the newspapers and seeing people of color or Muslims or whatever being bashed, putting on the TV channel, seeing white people discuss how people from other parts of the world are so how can you say it, backwards and this and that. I just can't take it. And even its most subtle forms, like only getting white scholars in my books and all that kind of stuff. So that is something I wanted to escape. I wanted to at least have a bit of a, it's everywhere, but at least not as bad as in the West. So in that sense, I don't feel very much attraction to go back in that sense. On the other hand, I have my family there, a lot of friends. It's kind of a beautiful country, and there's also a lot of good things. I don't hate my country. It will always be in my heart. Hong Kong is just very, very good living. If you have, like I said, if you just have a good job, then life is fantastic. But building a community like in your own native country, no, I don't see that happening here. I feel that personally, and I think Peter would agree with me, I feel that personally we are culturally too far off. Also because, of course, we are millennials. We are not teenagers or little kids anymore. So we are not at the point that we can almost turn into Hong Kongers to build a community here with these people from this culture, from China. So I think in that sense we have, of course, with Chinese friends, but to really build that community like in your own native country, that's not going to happen. But the funny thing is, you do that with other foreigners here, and that doesn't mean only Westerners. Like I have a lot of Nepalese friends, for example, people from Nepal. Why? Because there's just not a lot of Nepalese immigrants here, and I just get along with them in general very well. So you have also certain kind of cultures you get along with. But long story short, do I ever go back? Don't really know, but right now I don't think so. I still think it's better in the other side of the world.
Interesting. Peter, you said you had a question for me at the beginning.
Why, Sabby? Why? No, just to explain. So I moved to New York for college, but at the time I didn't have a favorite football team because I had like the Broncos when I was a kid because of John Elway and the big passing team. But then I was like, I don't have any connection to Denver, so I didn't have a team at the time. But then 9/11 happened. And right around that same time, when the whole country is going super jingo, like, yeah, let's go kill these ragged terrorists and like go rah rah, America, USA, USA. Right around that time, the Patriots team started winning. So not only did you have people in the Boston area or Massachusetts supporting them, you had people all over the country because everyone jumps on the winning team's bandwagon. So from my perspective, you had this mix of super jingoistic, super fake patriots wanting to wage war all over the world, extend the U.S. empire. And you had this team called the Patriots with red, white, and blue colors with a quarterback who, by the way, supported Donald Trump for the wrong reasons. He actually thought that, he was going to make America great again or whatever the hell. I have plenty of friends outside of the U.S. who supported Trump for correct reasons, which is he wanted to weaken the United States more. But he supported him for the wrong reasons. And then I forget what the other things, like there's the cheating scandals, whatever, but leave that aside. To me, it was all about, I'm living in this country that's going insane on bloodlust and extending the empire and rah rah USA #1. And then also the Patriots team becomes the most popular. And so to me, they're one and the same. Like the Patriots represents everything that's worse, that's bad about the United States.
Oh man, no. My roommate was the one who got me into the Patriots. That's where that comes from. So that goes all the way back. And then I ended up moving to Boston. So I've been here for a little over 10 years. And we just kept winning. Like, I don't know. Like after I moved here, we won even more. So that's where I am with that. In reference to the whole Trump thing, I didn't agree like with Tom Brady supporting Trump. I thought that was weird. I never knew where he really stood politically anyway before that, but I just thought that was odd. And then I found out they were friends or something like that prior to that. I know he did come back later on and disagree with Trump as time went by, but no, I didn't agree with like him supporting Trump or whatever. The cheating thing. People say that the Patriots went out there and cheated. They act like Tom Brady was going out there and throwing with a Nerf ball. I mean, come on, like, best player of all time. And you can tell Joe Montana said that too. Best player of all time. And sometimes I do cheat watch. I'll look over on Tampa Bay game and see how he's doing, but still a Patriots fan. But I think people just I think people don't like us because we won a lot.
Well, yeah, there's that too, because then I became a Jets fan while I was living in New York, and that never helps when it comes to treating the Patriots fairly. But yeah, to me, it's more just like the political connotations. It just seemed like, the Patriots and the neoconservative takeover of the U.S. government and the expansion of the empire, they all like are in the same bucket to me.
Karim's like, what?
That's Yankee stuff, man. That's Yankee stuff. I don't know.
Go Cardinals. They're a really fun team to watch.
Oh my gosh. Quick shout out, special event tomorrow, you guys. Please don't miss this. There is a healthcare summit. I will be there along with all of these wonderful people that you see here. So I'll be there at 1, and then I'll be there again at 3 or 3:30 with Vanguard as well. So don't miss that. That'll be on KRTD Media. Starts at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow. We got to talk more about healthcare in this country. Peter and Karim, thanks so much for coming on. This was fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Yeah, hopefully we can catch you sometime for an interview on our tiny channel, right, Peter?
Absolutely. And I just have to say, like, your Patriots fan notwithstanding, your intro music is like the best of any show. I always I'm bobbing my head. I love that song.
Oh, thank you. Jesse Jett made that song. He's a local artist. He's on Twitter a lot, but yeah, he's really good. He's made a lot of political songs as well. But thanks so much. Before you guys go, where can everybody find you?
Yeah, so they can find us on YouTube called Beattie Media. You can see the name below, and our Substack, of course, beattie.substack.com. And on Twitter, that's more Peter's department. What is it, Peter? At BetBeatP or something, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, BetBeat, and then just a P attached to it, right?
Awesome, guys. Thanks so much for coming on. All right, guys, don't forget Special Healthcare Summit tomorrow on KRTD. Have a good night. Keep up the fight.
Bye, Sabby.